Hello, ladies and gents. On the module A225 Block 1. It's Open University. On infants you today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAs. You want to broaden your horizon. You want to gain wisdom. You need to make sacrifices if you want to do well in life. In anything you do, any field that you take, you need to make sacrifices and set your vision straight. Set your vision to progressive progression. We're on Ambition and Anxiety, 1789 to 1840. This is edited by Paul Lawrence. What I usually try and influence young adults, IAPs, teenagers, youth today, is make sure you reference where you're getting your scripture from. The book is printed at the Open University, Walton Hall, Milton Keynes, MK76AA. We're on page 56. Unit 2, the Industrial Revolution. We get a highlighted pen because there's always words that you might need to jot down, find the meaning, see if there's any similarities, other words that are very similar. Maybe ones that are significant to your study that you want to put a contrast word that's very significant to your study also. Tools of meltware goods which had to be omitted may well have followed different trends. Clearly, all this required both a lot of calculation, making some bold estimates. Was the exercise worth it? Crafts made his first estimates of growth rates in the early 1980s, and they were widely discussed. Other historians subsequently challenged certain claims and suggested refinements, which in turn led to Kraft to adjust his figures. So, when we do research, research on the internet, we try and find graphs, statistics. It's always very good to refine your works, refer it to other references in your social scientist. Some of it could be historical if you're looking in past facts. You need to back your facts up. So it's always good to cross-reference different evidences. The version presented in Figure 2.1 reflects these collaborative discussions with other historians. Since then, Kraft's estimates have been challenged less frequently, and improvements to their figures have been minor. So it is perhaps fair to regard them as the present best guess as to what happened. This process of discussion and revision is common with quantitative data and has parallels in the debates between historians on how to interpret textual primary sources. Over time, a consensus emerges, although it can always be challenged by a radical new interpretation. So long as you remember that such figures are estimates and are subject to revision, you can use them to understand economic and other change, growth in the population. Figure 2.1 looks only at growth in production but ignores population, but it is fair. If the population is growing, one might expect the economy to grow too, since more people means more workers producing more goods, as well as larger markets for those goods. Thus, a further variable that economic historians have analysed is population growth in relation to industrial production. The first census in Britain took place in 1801. Table 2.1 gives population figures for the different parts of the British Isle between 1751 and 1851, using the census figures from 1801 onwards, and estimates for early years. The columns titled Percent INCR. It gives the increase in population over the previous decade. This gives us a picture of how the population of the different countries in the British Isles changed during the period of the Industrial Revolution. The figure for Scotland in 1751 is in fact for 1755 figures for Ireland in 1751 and 1771, and for 1754 and 1772, respectively. Sources figures from 1801 onwards are taken from Mitchell, 1988, page 9 to 10. The figures for England, 1761 to 91, are from Wrigley, 2007, page 55. The figure for Scotland in 1755 was calculated at the time by Alexander Webster, and the figures for Ireland, 1754 to 91, are from Colonel, 1952. Both sets of figures are as given in Mitchell, 1998. Examine the table and answer the following questions. Looking at the period 1801 to 51, when was the population fastest? This should take around 10 minutes. For this question, the best columns to use are the ones showing percentage increases for England and Wales and Scotland. And for Scotland, the increase was fast in the decade 1801 to 1821. No figure is available for Ireland for that decade. So the highest figure for the following one, 1821 to 31, the figure for 1781 to 91 shows that it appears to have been higher earlier. We're going to have a look at that in a sec. I've just got to quickly check something. 2 seconds. We're going to... The increase... 1811 to 21. Yeah, 1811 to 21. I can see that quite clearly. Page 58. The rates of population growth in the early 19th century were high. To give a comparison, the population of the UK grew by less than 3% per decade. In the final decade of the 20th century, although growth rates have since risen slightly. You may have noted that the population growth in England and Wales was higher than in Scotland and Ireland in the early 19th century, and indeed, that population of Ireland dropped dramatically in the decade of 1841 to 51. This is due to famine, which is discussed in the unit Ireland and the famine in Block 2. There has been much debate among historians about the reasons for population growth from the 18th century onwards, and considerable research has been conducted into England, hence the figures from Wrigley 2007. We used the table 2.1. Using data from parish, it registers to reconstruct population figures from the 16th century onwards. Wrigley and his colleagues argue that the rate population growth began to rise in 1701 and was the highest in early 19th century, Wrigley and Schofield, 1981. Furthermore, it is now widely agreed that this rise in the growth rate was due more to a rise in the birth rate than to fall in the death rate. Changes in migration patterns, which is a third factor that could affect population growth, are seen as having a minor role in this period. The percentage of people getting married rose, as did the number of illegitimate children. But the main reason for growth in the population was that women were getting married earlier and had more children in marriage. The effects of population growth on the economy, rather than exploring the causes of the rise in population, however, I want to focus on the economic consequences. Figure 2.2 combines data on change in industrial production during the Industrial Revolution with that on population. Note that this table is for production for industry only, as in figure 2.1, but this time it covers England alone. Examine figure 2.2 and answer the following question. What conclusions can be drawn from it about the rate of industrial growth? I'm going to say from 1790 up to 1830 increased massively. Production per head 1730 to 1830. The chart of figure 2 gives data across the x-axis, but you'll notice the y-axis is different. It used an index in which growth rate is 1780 is given as 100, so that the lower growth rates are given as less than 100 and higher growth rates are given as more than 100. Note that progression on the axis is geometric, that is, the distance from 100 to 200. It's half that between 0 to 100 and so on. The chart also has two curves. The solid line addresses the same issue on figure 2.1. It shows the rate of growth in industrial production per year. The dotted line also shows growth in industrial production, but this time per head, the total divided by the population. You will recall from exercise 2.1 that the growth rate for industrial production in the 18th century was relatively low. This is reflected here too. In 1730, industrial production was already 60% of the 1780 figure. But the growth rate for industrial production per head was even lower. The 1730 figure was no less than 80% of the 1780 figure. Both rates did speed up over time. You may have noted that the effect of the geometric progression is to unlay growth rates over 100. By 1830, industrial production per head had increased by 70% compared to the figure 1780, or that for the production has tripled. Population growth was a cause for concern in the early 19th century. The demographer Thomas Matthews, about whom you'll learn more in the unit Managing Uncertainty, New Forms of Knowledge. This Unit 4 was concerned that it would outstrip the ability of the country to feed itself, and this remained and remains a concern in pre-industrial societies. The supply of land is not unlimited, so the main effect of more people is more mouths to feed in increasingly crowded countryside. More people to work the same land does not usually result in an equivalent increase in food. In the past, there had been crises of overpopulation in all parts of British Isles, when bad harvests, crop diseases, or even other catastrophes had resulted in stretched supply of food, proving inadequate. England had avoided such crises since 1623, but famine in Scotland in the 1690s had killed perhaps one person in 7, and Ireland had suffered a famine in 1740-41, Houston 1988, that the supply of food remained sufficient for the growing population in the 18th century. Britain was a sign that something had changed for the better. That was due to a combination of agriculture and industrial change. By bringing more land into cultivation and switching to improved agriculture methods such as a better crop rotation, it was possible to continue raising the supply of food produced by the English and the lowland Scottish countryside, even if not everyone was working the land. At the same time, industrial production in towns or more common in the 18th century in industrial villages meant that many workers could produce goods that could be sold for food. As a result, the growing population of the 18th century could be fed. Imports in exchange for manufactured goods also played a role. Feeding an increasing population was already an achievement, even though it simply shows figure 2.2 as a gentle upward curve. All this makes what happened after 1800 even more remarkable. Figure 2.1, 2.2 show a gradual increase in the upward curve over time, indicating an increase in the rate of growth. This is not linked to any slackening in population growth. On the contrary, as you have seen, population growth was fastest in the early 19th century. Industrialisation allowed Britain to escape what is sometimes called the from round 1780 onwards. The growth rate of industrial production in Britain was faster than it had ever been before, despite a rapidly growing population. Activity 2.1. Now go to the module website and complete Activity 2.1, Urbanisation. This could take around 30 minutes. Regions and industrialisation. In the previous section, you read that there was a growth in industrial production in Britain, but this was relatively slow in the 18th century, accelerating after around 1780. So, how does the picture of the economy and that economy that was certainly growing even per head of population in a time of high population growth? But where growth was for long periods fairly notes, it fits with the idea of an industrial revolution and changes described by Stearns and others, particularly of the course of the term revolution can be justified by the significance rather than the speed of change. But another way that historians have sought to defend the idea of an industrial revolution is to argue that the national figures you consider in section 2.1 hide important regional differences. In other words, dramatic changes could have been happening in certain parts of the country, while others were experiencing relatively little change. This section will investigate this idea by looking at various areas of Britain in more detail, starting with Lancashire. If you need to check the location of any of the places mentioned, there is a map on the module website. Lancashire. The classic example of a region that experienced rapid and obvious industrialisation was Lancashire, the first centre of the cotton production in Britain. Cotton, which comes from the tropical countries. It was a new industry in the 18th century Britain, and it both grew rapidly and is soon organised in new ways. The English cotton industry was based in the district around Manchester, and then in any ways South Lancashire became the showcase of the Industrial Revolution, as described in the earlier quote for Stearns. Machine power was applied first to spinning and later to weaving. And labour was organised and disciplined for the large mills and the factories that were built. These images in figures 2.1 and 2.3 to 4 show external and internal scenes from these early factories, although either conveys the dirt or noise involved. Atlas was the first such industrial region in the world. The mills and the factories of Lancashire, not surprisingly, figure large in how the Industrial Revolution is often imagined today. But Lancashire was not an island of change in a sea of community. If it was the most extreme example of a region of rapid industrial change, and other regions also experienced industrial and, as in Lancashire. Figure 2.3, it shows the cotton mills of Swayson, Burley and Co. in Preston, Lancashire. Figure 2.4 shows bobbin and drawing frames in Lancashire Mill. It's 1830. The photos from Chronicle Alarmy, drawing frames and machines to draw out the silvers of the cotton for spinning, bobbin machines, wind the yarn around the bobbins for weaving. The means are powered by wheels and leather belts and are operated by girls and young women. The boy carrying away with the finished spoils is barefoot. On page 664, the Industrial Revolution 2. This was often built around one or two of the main industries. The map in figure 2 shows some of the main areas in the early industrialisation in the British Isles of them and their main industries. The West Yorkshire become a centre of the woolen industry, while Sheffield become famous for steel wares of Stoke-on-Trent for pottery and china. However, some areas either failed to industrialise or saw the decline of their industrial manufacturing trades. Not only did regions and towns develop in different ways, but our industries developed also differed. The following three subjections will consider two parts of Britain that followed different routes of industrial development in the Birmingham area and the west of Scotland before looking briefly at two areas that did not develop in the same way. The country of Wales. Birmingham and the Black Country, of a very different path to industrialisation from Lancashire, was taken by Birmingham and the Black Country to its northwest. This region had long been a centre of the metal industry, specialising in the production of a wide range of essential metal goods, from nails and buttons and chains and guns. Turn to reading 2.1, Samuel Schroeder. Daybook, 1748 to 1751, located at the end of the unit. Written by a Swedish visitor to Britain. This is a description of the production of first buttons, then gun barrels, major sites to attract visitors from both home and abroad. Although Manchester was more visited, the factories and workshops of Birmingham also received visitors. Read the text now and then answer the following question. Does Schroeder's description of the industrial process involve making buttons and gun barrels tally with the popular nations of the industrialization, as illustrated in 2.4, which foreground steam-driven machine and low-skilled labour factory? So we're going to look at the gun barrels. We're going to guess their metal and buttons. I don't know. The button production, like the bobbin and jaw mill, use a division of labour, which sometimes tasks performed by children. The work of the adult men in two and Birmingham workshops sound highly skilled. Particularly that of the man drilling the gun barrel. Birmingham and the Black Country produced a hard range of goods. Iron was essential for many of them, and iron was found in the south. Iron was found in South Staffordshire, as was the coal. This was meant that once the process of smelting iron using coke from coal rather than charcoal from wood was understood, many iron furnaces sprang up there. The towns in the Black Country closest to the ironworks specialised in heavy iron goods such as chains and anchors, hollow goods such as boilers, and wheeled equipment. In Birmingham itself, guns were one of the main products. There was a huge varied demand for military to sporting use, and a large number was sold for the slave trade. The Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars, 1793-1815, kept demand high, and there was a decade-long slump when the army stopped buying weapons in 1815. But export markets were also important. A second major industry was what was described as a toy trade, which encompassed a whole range of consumer metal goods, from the gadgets and buttons to locks and hand tools. Two features that all the toy trade manufacturers had in common were, first, that they all needed to produce a high variety of wares, and second, that they were subject to the fashion. The most striking example is when the buckles fell out of style in the 1780s, as they were replaced by shoelaces and buttons. Hopkins, 1989. Jewellery, another Birmingham specialism, was around 1800s, was in many ways an extension of the toy trade, and similarly subject to change in fashion. Another major industry was the brass trade. Again, this partially served consumer markets such as carriages fittings, but as the industrial revolution progressed, demand for pipes, fittings for steam engines and for gas lighting grew. As with all the Birmingham industries, demand came not only from the UK but also from abroad. In a time when production in other countries was often small scale, Birmingham was the largest manufacturer in the world for many of these goods. Finally, one early 19th century development of these industries was the design of steam engines at the giant Soho works owned by Matthew Boulton. 1728-1809. In 1775, he entered into the partnership with James Watt, 1738-1819, to exploit Watt's patent for improvements to the steam engine, and the Soho works remained the main centre for steam engine manufacture as long as the patent lasted. Birmingham, however, was for a long time not itself a major consumer of steam engines. In 1815, there were only about 40 in use in the town of Hopkins, 1989. Figure 2.6. Unknown artist, interior of Aston Flint glasswork source. Wrightstone in 1818. Glassmaking was another of Birmingham's industries. Note the range of different processes being carried out by men and boys in this picture. The gandering of work. You have noted in figures 2.4 and 2.6 and the reading 2.1 that some tasks were performed by children. Descriptions of work during the Industrial Revolution also show that work was heavily gendered. That is, some tasks were regarded as suitable for men and others for women. To a certain extent, this was related to physical characteristics. Some male tasks required physical strength, while women were seen as suitable for tasks that required great manual dexterity of patience, such as, for instance, tying broken threads in drawing frames, and gender division of labour was also a tradition in farming, and therefore part of the recent experience of many workers. There were, nevertheless, many exceptions. A classical example, the Black Country, that impressed visitors to the region were female chain makers in Wolverhampton. Women and children also worked in mines until the Mines Act of 1842, although usually performing different tasks from men. More complex was the relationship between different tasks and rates of pay. Some industrial work, such as gun barrel drilling, described in Figure 2.2, was highly skilled, and workers with such skills were able to command high rates of pay. But more generally, many tasks performed by men come to be seen as skilled or semi-skilled regardless of their complexity.